TorahCafe.com.
Here's an interesting thing to consider. A pig in Hebrew is called a chazir. And the word chazir actually comes from the root word chazer, to return. And it is suggested the reason why it is so called is because osid chazir lehitar, the pig itself will in the future revert or return to becoming kosher. By definition, certain animals are not necessarily inherently non-kosher. They have certain non-kosher signs, or rather they're lacking in signs which reflect the fact that God for the moment forbids us to eat them, but when Mashiach comes, that will all change. That's the general suggestion. That's great news, but it begs clarity. Is that simply semantics, or is there some truth to it? Does it really make sense, I ask you, that what is not kosher now will one day become so? Or to put the question differently, does it make sense that kosher, which is a law of the Torah itself, which is the Bible of God, that stipulates laws and gives me direction for life, does it make sense that that very Torah is subject to change? Is the Torah immutable, or is it not? That's essentially the question. That's what we're going to explore during this lecture. And the reason why it's such an interesting question is because, in actual fact, as we'll see when we go through some of our source sheets, there are references, there are allusions within the Torah, more particularly within the Talmud, that seem indeed to suggest that the Torah as we know it now will be abrogated. And that has been a point of argument that Christians have in the past used in a lot of their polemical debates, and I'm talking about going back many centuries. They would reference the Talmud, they would reference a number of sources, they would point to them, and they would say, hey, look, see, you have in your own sources the suggestion that the Torah itself is not immutable. So that's your Old Testament, that's your Old Torah, and already now we are introducing the New Testament as we know it to be divinely ordained, as they would claim. And therefore we need to explore these sources. We need to understand, is it indeed the case? Does Torah itself lend itself to being subject to change? So let's actually take it from the top. Before we actually look at the first two sources from Maimonides himself, the concept of the divine origin of Torah, we know, of course, is something that is fundamental to Jewish faith. We believe, with perfect faith, that God gave the Torah to Moses at Sinai. And directly related to this is the principle of the fact that these laws of the Torah are not subject to change. To use the words of Maimonides, this Torah of Moses will not be abrogated, and there will not be another Torah from God. Nothing can be added to it, nothing can be subtracted from it. Neither from the written nor the oral Torah, as God himself said, you shall not add and diminish from it. So look over here in they're not actually numbered, unfortunately, but on page 2, the second paragraph. In that second paragraph on page 2, you have this clear reference, Torah of Moshe will never be nullified. No other Torah will come from it. It's very clear cut. Which of course begs then the question, well, pig, the Torah says, is an abomination. How do you reconcile that with this statement of Maimonides when we're suggesting that, in actual fact, it'll become kosher in due course? Now, if we look back on page 2 at source number 1, you have Maimonides again. This is taken from his magnum opus, from his foundational laws, and he says, it is a matter stated clearly and explicitly in the Torah that it is a mitzvah that endures forever and ever without change. Nothing to be subtracted, nothing to be added. And again, he quotes a number of verses over there all the way through, and he concludes basically on this point that essentially nothing of the Torah is ever to be changed. And let's leave Maimonides alone for a second. Let's just consider rationally the immutability of Torah itself is axiomatic in traditional Judaism. That is to say, think about it. If the Torah is given by God, which by definition means it is an extension of the divine wisdom, then just as God doesn't change, clearly the Torah, which is an extension from God, doesn't change. Moreover, there is a verse in Psalms, not in your source sheets, Torah's Hashem Temima. The Torah of God is perfect. It's the absolute truth of God. Well then, hey, if perfection and truth can never suffer change, otherwise it wouldn't be perfect and it cannot be truth, then Torah, which is described by the psalmist as being perfection and being truth, cannot be changed. Indeed, so fundamental is this principle that it is incorporated not just in what you have over here on your page 2, but it's actually incorporated in Maimonides' 13 principles of faith. Maimonides has basic principles of faith that some people have accustomed to recite every given day. And these purposes, these principles of faith serve not only the purpose of clarifying the articles of faith incumbent upon the observant Jew, but was also used, as I said, in polemics to refute Christian and Islamic claims that the Torah of Moshe was superseded by their alleged new revelations of the New Testament and the Quran. So Maimonides himself, as a fundamental principle of faith, stipulates this very same point, that it is immutable. In fact, there are other sources, for example, like Rabbi Yosef Karo and Rabbi Yosef Albo and others who have their own principles of faith, and they may not include this in their 13 or 14 or 12 principles of faith that they themselves have, but that's not a contradiction because their fundamental principle of faith is something that is otherwise inconceivable. This is something that's taken for granted. So let's just leave it at this point. On page 2, those two sources quoted from Maimonides, coupled with one of his principles, the 13 principles of faith, we have established at present that nothing is subject to change. Everything stays as it is, which means, frankly, that I have to disappoint you from the outset and tell you that even though we began by talking about the pig that will eventually become kosher, it won't. The Big Mac is out. No big deal. I can live with that. I lived with that for the past 46 years. I can live with that for the next 46 years and 46 years after that ad infinitum. But again, the problem is not with me and not the fact that I can not now tuck into something. The problem is with the Torah itself. Because inasmuch as the immutability might be the guiding principle, we will now look at sources that seem to categorically refute this. Look at page 3, the source that you have over there. Our rabbis taught a garment in which wool and linen mixture is present but not identifiable. You cannot sell this to an idolater, nor should one make it into a donkey saddle, but one may make it into shrouds for the deceased. And Rabbi Yosef says, this tells us that mitzvot will be nullified in the future. In other words, we know we have a prohibition of the Torah of mixing wool and linen, right? And certainly if we're wearing that sort of garment whilst we're walking and talking, then that's something that halacha necessitates, Jewish law says, we have to immediately remove. But here we have a law in the Talmud that says clearly that you can make shrouds of a mixture of wool and linen, and you can bury the dead in it. And Rabbi Yosef determines from that we see that the Torah itself will, or the laws of the Torah will be nullified in the future. How is that actually implied from the Torah? Well, turn over onto your next page, from the Talmud, turn over on the next page, number 4 at the top. This is the Tosafot, this is the commentary on the Talmud, and he tells us very simply, he quotes again from the Talmud, Rabbi Yosef said, this tells us that the mitzvot will be nullified in the future. And he says, but from the ruling that one may in principle make shrouds from wool, linen, even though when the dead will rise in the future, they will be in the garments in which they were buried, conclude from this that the mitzvot will be nullified in the future. You see, that's the problem. If you can bury dead people in shrouds made of a mixture of wool and linen, which is forbidden to the Jew, it's also fundamental to Jewish belief that there will be tchiyat hamesim, there will be a resurrection of the dead. These people will wake up. And when they do, God willing, wake up, they will all be wearing forbidden clothing. They'll be wearing mixture of wool and linen. Of course, we can say, well, okay, but then you have to immediately remove it. That won't be a very pretty picture when millions of Jews get up and suddenly have to discard with their shrouds. But in the first instance, we see it's not a problem. We're not concerned with them waking up, wearing these shrouds that are a mixture of wool and linen. And from there, Rabbi Yosef concludes categorically this means that obviously those prohibitions, Torah laws, mitzvot in general, will not be applicable in the Messianic era when that resurrection is to take place. That's source one, to refute the principle. In other words, to suggest that mitzvot will be abolished, to suggest that the pig will become kosher. Let's look at the next paragraph on page 4. This is the Jerusalem Talmud. There are a bunch of rabbis listed over here, and they're talking about the various different books of the prophets and the writings, which they suggest categorically will become void in the future. The only thing that won't become void, they stress, is the 5 books of the Torah. They will remain. And they reference this from the verse that says, a loud voice that did not cease. And by definition, it'll never cease. In other words, the 5 books that were given as part of that loud voice at Sinai, those will remain, but the prophets and all the other books, in other words, the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim, the prophets and the scriptures, will become null and void. And then you have Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, who adds a further point to this and suggests that's already on the top of page 5. Even the Megillah of Esther and the laws will not be nullified. And he brings his proof sources for that. So, what are we being told? We're being told that the 5 books of Moses will remain. We're being told that the book of Esther will remain. But we're being told that the prophets and the scriptures, which is an awful lot of text, that will become null and void, that will no longer be of any relevance. So in other words, you have on the one hand some kind of immutability still, but at the same time there'll be at least one critical change such that the biblical books will be voided. On page 5, in your second source over there, we have the Medrash on Mishlei, on Proverbs, which seems, again, we won't go through it all in its detail, but it seems to concur with the opinion that we just quoted from Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish with regard to the book of Esther as indeed remaining in the times of when Mashiach will come. Moreover, Purim itself as a festival will also remain, together with Yom Kippur. Now, if the suggestion is that Purim will remain together with Yom Kippur, that would seem to imply that the rest of the festivals will fall by the wayside. Great news, ladies, no more Pesach cleaning. That's the implication here. In fact, to substantiate this point, let's look on page 6 at the main source we have over there. Moses said to the people, remember this day in which you went out from Egypt. From this one can derive that by daytime one must mention leaving Egypt, as we do when we recite the Shema. From where do we derive that we must do so at night? Because it says, in order that you should remember the day that you left Egypt all the days of your life. The days of your life would imply the day. All the days of your life, the superfluous word all would include also the nights. That's the quote of Ben Zoma as also taken from the Mishnah. The rabbis say, the days of your life, this means morning and evening in this world, when we say the Shema. All the days of your life should include also then the days of Mashiach as well. Says Ben Zoma to them, in the future, we will not mention the exodus from Egypt. As it says, therefore, behold, the days are coming, God says, in which will no longer be said, etc. He quotes a whole entire verse over there from Jeremiah to actually suggest that in the future, the mention of the exodus will not take place. And the suggestion, the reason, the rationale for that is very simple. For the moment, it's the singular greatest event that happened in our Jewish history, that which culminated with the giving of the Torah at Sinai. The Exodus was the birth of our nation. But when Mashiach comes, whatever happened then is going to pale in significance to the greater redemption and the revelations that we'll experience with Mashiach's coming. So Ben Zoma, as quoted by the Mechilta, by the Medrash over here on page 6, is telling us very categorically that the mention of Exodus will no longer be a requirement, even though today it's a critical mitzvah. Even though today we are obligated to do it. in the Shema as we do morning and evening. When Mashiach comes, not so. And we can logically assume that if there's no need to mention the Exodus, because it'll pale in significance to the revelations and redemption of Mashiach, then there will be no need to celebrate Pesach either. For that matter, not just Pesach, but indeed any of the festivals. The main 3 foot festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, essentially are all linked with the Exodus from Egypt. Sukkot is because we sat in huts when we left Egypt. Shavuot is because we got the Torah when we came out from Egypt, the culmination of the Exodus. Pesach itself, of course, marking the Exodus. If all of this is going to become insignificant in the bigger scheme of things, we will no longer need to celebrate these festivals. The only one that we will clearly, it seems, still be celebrating, as we referenced in our earlier source, is Purim. Why? It's a good question. I'm not complaining. It's a great opportunity to drink, and maybe we know that our natures are not going to change, and we still need that even in Mashiach's times. But the other festivals will cease to be. You have on page 7 at the top, and this is discussing fast days. Also good news. As much as we now have to go through some torturous fasts on particular days, the reference here tells us those days will in the future be holidays. So not only will we no longer have to fast, but in actual fact we'll be celebrating. And if you look in the next paragraph on page 7, here we have a very curious and radical statement. Our rabbis taught, mamzerim, which are children born from illegitimate relationships, will become purified of their disability to marry within the body of the people in the future. These are the words of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Meir says, no, they'll remain not pure. And then there's a whole discussion to and fro about this. And if you look over on the top of your next page, on page 8, without going into all the debate that they had in between, the last line of the top paragraph, Rabbi Yehuda said, in the name of Shmuel, the law follows Rabbi Yossi. In other words, this Rabbi Yossi who told us that indeed, in the Messianic era, mamzerim, these are children born from illegitimate relationships. These are children whom the Torah says, tragically, by no fault of their own, admittedly, can never marry into the Jewish faith per se, other than to other mamzerim. Rabbi Yossi tells us, in Mashiach's times, they will become purified. By definition, now they're welcome back to be able to marry anyone amongst the Jewish people. And as much as there's a lot of debate in the Talmud and discussion to and fro about the point of Rabbi Yossi, as we said, the Talmud concludes, Rabbi Yehuda told us, the ruling, the law, follows Rabbi Yossi. So there you have it. All these different sources that are telling us the dead will be buried in shrouds made of wool and linen. By definition, wool and linen will become acceptable because they're going to wake up in it. Festivals are going to all be abolished, even though the Torah tells us at the moment we have to adhere to them. Mention of the Exodus is going to be abolished because it will no longer be relevant. Fast days are going to turn into days of celebration. And even those currently forbidden from marrying into the Jewish faith, some anyway, will in the times of Mashiach be allowed to do so. If all of that does not categorically suggest that the Torah itself is subject to change, then what does? So you see clearly that the Torah itself is not immutable. It will indeed change. The pig will become kosher. Just as a perhaps final reference over here, and again, I don't know if they put the whole Talmudic piece in it, but on the bottom of page 8 and the top of page 9, we don't really need to go through all of this, but the general gist, if you were to look at it in your own time, it's just from the opening line, essentially, where it says that in the future the land of Israel will be divided among 13 tribes. Presently, it's divided up amongst 12 tribes of Israel, but the tribe of Joseph is split into 2. The tribe that is excluded in the Torah itself is the tribe of Levi. The Torah itself stipulates that Levi, the tribe of Levi, did not have a direct share in the land of Israel, an allocated portion like the other tribes. The tribe of Levi had the different cities of refuge, etc. But the Talmud here is telling me again categorically that in the Messianic era, in the future, it will be divided properly into 13 tribes. The tribe of Levi will have their fair share. A contradiction again to what it says in the Torah. A suggestion again that the Torah is not immutable, that it is subject to change, that it will change. All right, maybe we'll throw in one more over here on the bottom of page 9. And perhaps this is the more reassuring one that we've been looking for all along. Rabbi Brachya said in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, this is the bottom of page 9 going on to page 10, in the future, the Blessed Holy One will make a feast for his righteous servants, that's you and me, and whoever never ate meat, not properly slaughtered in this world, in other words, we always ensure to keep to kosher, will merit to enjoy non-slaughtered meat in the world to come. And again, he cites a proof text for this. That is why Moshe warns Israel as the last line by saying to them, these are the animals you may eat. In other words, if you make sure not to eat non-kosher now, God's going to make a great feast, invite you and me to the party, and there he's going to serve us, in effect, what would now be considered non-kosher meat. And the Medrash, following on from that in the next paragraph, there are those who say that the Blessed Holy One will make pure in the future every animal that is declared impure in this world. That is essentially the basis for the aforementioned source that we quoted regarding the kosher pig. It's not, the reference about the pig itself is not actually cited in Midrashic sources. It's brought elsewhere, but this is really the reference for it. This very quote, that in the future, every animal that is declared impure in this world, God will make pure. So then it begs the question, how do we deal with this? How do we reconcile Maimonides himself? Isn't he the one who stressed so categorically, as we began with, that it doesn't change? It can't change. Didn't we arrive at a logical conclusion that if Torah itself is an extension of God, God doesn't change? So then the Torah, which is an extension of him, surely can't change either. And yet, we have all these sources that clearly indicate very much the contrary. And it is precisely these sources, and others besides, that yes, Christians used to quote when they engaged in debates with the likes of the Abarbanel, with the likes of Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, and other greats throughout history that we'll come to, who had to grapple with these, who had to engage in those sort of debates, public debates sometimes, and were thrown these sources to say, well, there you go. You see, your own Talmud says that it is all subject to change, hence your Old Testament is superseded by our New Testament. How do we then reconcile with these sources? Well, what I want to do in the first instance is actually look at some simpler solutions or reconciliations to some of the sources. Well, let's just consider this. You don't need to look at your text at this point. We're going to just follow a little bit of a logical process. When we talk about the annulment of fasts, and we talk about the abolishment of festivals, which I know is great news because, like I said, no Pesach cleaning, and all right, maybe, I don't know if you spend your Pesach on holiday somewhere in Israel or wherever else besides, but, still. And the irrelevance of prophets and scriptures. What about that? Well, think about this. If you abolish the festivals, or you do away with fast days, or you talk about the prophets and the scriptures being no longer relevant, that does not affect the Torah per se. The books of the prophets and the scriptures are essentially exhortations. They're rebukes. If you look at most of the prophets, the books, the texts themselves, you either have a bit of history being told to you about what happened in the times of Joshua, what happened in the times of the judges, etc. And when you go further down into the prophets, well, then you get some pretty spooky stuff. You just get a lot of rebuke from Jeremiah, Isaiah, etc. You also get some positive stuff from other prophets like Ezekiel and so forth, reflecting on the times of the Messianic era, etc. And now all of those rebukes of the prophets are about future events, but they don't have practical implications. They are not legal rulings. They're not commandments. Their relevance is not in principle for all times. Besides, if in the Messianic era the world is going to be filled with the knowledge of God, the prophet Ezekiel himself said, I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh. The occupation of the world at that point in time is going to be all about just knowing God. Well, then who needs those rebukes anymore? Who needs those exhortations anymore? They're no longer relevant. If most of the prophets are made up of rebuke about, hey, if you misbehave, this is going to happen, well, when Mashiach comes, it means we've done good, we've made good, it's all history. The rest of the prophets talk about what will happen in the Messianic era. I don't need that anymore. I'm living it. I'm experiencing it. So I don't have a problem with the prophets and the scriptures themselves actually becoming null and void or irrelevant, as some of our sources suggested. Even as there may be certain laws that are explicated in some of the prophetic books, they're not post-Mosaic innovations. Prophets were forbidden from innovating, from adding anything new into the actual Torah itself. They only used the Torah for reference, for allusion only. And those laws will only have been needed or introduced by the prophets as alluded to in the Torah for temporary measures at temporary given times. They will not be required in the Messianic era. So you'll say to me, well, what about the book of Esther? Why are we going to still have the book of Esther itself? Why will that be retained, as one of the sources mentioned? That's simply an exception because of an explicit prophecy cited therein. In other words, there's a verse in the book of Esther itself that says their memory will never be abolished. It should never cease from all their offspring. So in other words, if the book of Esther stipulates that it should never cease, then it will never cease. And that's why it'll be retained. But the rest of the books, no problem. What about Purim and the other festivals? Aren't the festivals, like we said, biblically mandated? Well, I think we can offer a twofold solution to this. Purim indeed should be abolished together with all the other festivals if they're going to be abolished. But if the actual Megillah, if the book of Esther stipulates that it should be retained always and forever, if there is the safeguarding of the permanence of the scroll, and the choice wording is, V'hayamim ha'elu niskarim v'nasim, and these days shall always be remembered, then for that reason alone, Purim, which is the day itself, which is part and parcel of these days, will always be remembered. So how do we annul the other festivals? Well, here's a bit of a cheap answer for you, and you're not going to like it. That's simply the opinion, like we said, of Ben Zoma. The rabbis disagreed with him. The rabbis maintained, as we said, and we cited in that source, that the mention of the Exodus will still take place in the Messianic era. And if the mention of the Exodus is still to take place, that means the festivals are still to take place as well. The ruling then should follow them, because they're the majority. So sorry, ladies, Pesach is back in. And the same can be applied with regard to fasts as well. Why do we have fast days? Every fast day that we have, 17th of Tammuz, to reflect on the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem, 9th of Av, to reflect on the destruction of the temple. All the fast days that we have, 10th of Teves, etc., all the fast days are essentially because we are lamenting destructions of the past. When Mashiach comes, again, it's in the past. It's history. I don't care anymore. I've got my Israel back. I've got my Jerusalem back. I've got my temple back. Great news. I don't need those fast days anymore. They're only there to serve a very specific and critical purpose. And there's a suggestion, another source, which we didn't reference over here in the actual text itself, but it's in there, where we talk about the fact that sacrifices in the future will be annulled. And in that same source, it also talks about the fact that prayers will be annulled. The only thing that will remain is the Thanksgiving sacrifice. The only thing that will remain is the Thanksgiving prayers. So how does that work? Well, again, even though the Torah talks about all different kinds of sacrifices, essentially all those sacrifices are for wrongdoings, for misdeeds. They're all linked in somehow to doing something wrong, bar the exception of the Thanksgiving sacrifice. So whilst there will no longer be any sin in the Messianic era, there will no longer be any need, and that's the meaning when they say the sacrifices will no longer be. There won't be the need to bring sacrifices, general sacrifices that are mostly linked with misdeed, wrongdoing, guilt offerings, etc., etc. Broken promises, what have you. We're going to be good people. We're going to be pure. We're not going to do things wrong. And therefore, we won't need to bring these sacrifices. Thanksgiving? Sure. We'll continue to give thanks to God. We'll continue to appreciate all the goodness He does for us. Indeed, even more so then. So those sort of sacrifices we'll continue to bring. And similarly then, when we talk about prayers, well, what are prayers? Prayers are essentially to stipulate all of our needs before God. Life, sustenance, children, healing, and so forth. If in the Messianic era, First of all, again, there'll be the abolishment of sin, such that we won't have to reference those prayers. And in the Messianic era itself, God is going to provide us with everything in abundance. To quote Maimonides, all good things will be bestowed in abundance, and all delicacies will be accessible like dust. Well, I don't need to pray anymore. I don't need to stipulate my needs before God. I won't need anything. But I'll still be wanting to thank God for everything that I have. So the Thanksgiving prayers will actually remain in. Again, with regard to the tribe of Levi getting a share in the land of Israel, I dare say there's again differences of opinion. So Maimonides will side with those opinions. Or some will argue that it shouldn't be taken literally, it should be taken metaphorically. When we talk about, for example, the idea of forbidden foods becoming permissible, there's a curious one. Some sources suggest that it doesn't mean literally forbidden foods per se. It actually refers to certain nations of the world. That is to say that certain nations of the world can be compared to certain forbidden animals. I don't think any of us would have a problem comparing Iran or Hamas or Hezbollah to ferocious beasts, animals, pigs, and what have you. And the point is that they will become kosher. In other words, that they, like the rest of the world, will suddenly come to acknowledge and embrace the reality of God. So the non-kosher animals, as we might see certain nations of the world today, will essentially become kosher. They themselves will now come to appreciate divinity in its fullest form. Now, I know, this is just a tease then. Rabbi Schochet, why did you waste our time? You quoted us a bunch of sources. You blew our minds away. We're getting excited. No Pesach, yes Big Mac, etc. And then you come and you dismiss that all by simply citing other sources that contradict, etc., etc. So don't panic yet. It's not the end of the story. But it is worthwhile at this point to reflect on two final sources. Sources that seem to substantiate the point of the immutability of Torah. Look at the bottom of page 11. Just to give you a little bit of context. Actually, it's on page 11, it's the second paragraph on page 11. You know, it was the case that you could not actually eat from the new grain until a sacrifice, the Omer sacrifice, was brought on the second day of Pesach. Okay, that's why we celebrate part of what we do with not the counting of the Omer, but the Omer, and why we refer to it as such. Second day of Pesach, special sacrifice was brought in the morning, after which point you could then eat from the new grain. What the Mishnah tells us in your second source, or second paragraph on page 11, is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, in the middle of that paragraph, ordained that, at the very last line over there, the eating of new grain should be forbidden the entire day in which the Omer was meant to be offered. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is talking about after the temple was destroyed. In temple times, the sacrifice was brought, the Omer sacrifice, the new grain sacrifice, in the morning of the second day of Pesach, after which new grain could be consumed. Says Rabbi Yochanan, after the temple was destroyed, that whole day one should not eat any new grain. Wait till the following day, third day of Pesach. Why? The Talmud explains in the bottom paragraph over here, because at any given moment in time, Mashiach can come. If we were allowed, say last year, for this past Pesach, second days, we don't have a sacrifice to bring, so we can surely start eating the new grain first thing in the morning. In temple times, I had to wait till after the sacrifice was brought in the morning. Today I don't have a sacrifice, so I can eat the new grain first thing in the morning because there's no sacrifice. So Rabbi Yochanan, no, don't do that. Why? Because if Mashiach comes imminently, then the problem is that when it comes to the next Pesach, you'll think first thing in the morning I can eat it again. And yet you won't, because you have to wait for the sacrifice to be brought. So you don't want to make that mistake. Actually, it teaches us two important principles. Number one, it teaches us, as an incidental point, that we have to live our lives as though Mashiach is coming always imminently, and keep that in mind. Rabbi Yochanan enacts a decree on that basis. But more to the point, Rabbi Yochanan is telling us that the reason why we should not eat new grain first thing in the morning and wait the entire day now in our exile state is because when Mashiach comes, we'll have to wait for the sacrifice to be brought first before we could eat that new grain. In other words, that mitzvah is going to come back. Mitzvahs will come back. And if I refer you as a final source, and this is the final source, on page 12, and perhaps the most compelling source of all, Rabbi Yochanan said, again, Rabbi Yochanan, where does the Torah teach about the resurrection of the dead? Where do we find this principle alluded to in the Torah? And he quotes, you will give from it God's truma to Aaron the priest. In the Torah itself, we talk about different offerings that had to be brought to the high priest, to the priests, to the Levites, etc. So there the Torah talks about the truma, which was the unique gift that was given to Kohanim, to priests. And the Torah says, you will give that truma, that special priestly offering, to Aaron the priest. Here's the problem. That gift offering didn't come into effect until the Jews settled in the land of Israel. Aaron never settled in the land of Israel. He died in the desert. When exactly are we supposed to be giving this gift offering to Aaron, the high priest? From there we see, and from there we learn, that obviously there'll be a resurrection of the dead. Aaron himself will come back. And when he does, we will again be bringing him this gift offering. That clearly indicates, besides the proof of the resurrection of the dead, that, again, mitzvahs will be restored. We'll be giving the gift offering. We'll be fulfilling the mitzvah of bringing truma to Aaron, the high priest, etc., etc. So that should seem to be case closed. We've explained away all the different sources. We've brought two final proof texts to show that certain mitzvah clearly will be continued in the Messianic era, which would imply that others would be as well, and that therefore, here we are again, the Big Mac is out, Pesach is in, like it or not, that's just the way it is. But that's not the whole picture, because surely someone here should have picked up on something I left out. Anyone? It suggests that Yom Kippur will continue as a festival. The source that brings Purim says that Yom Kippur will continue as well. That's for our sins. It's a very good question. And there's a bigger question, because there's one source that we referenced, which is the mixture of wool and linen. And we're all going to wake up in those shrouds. We're going to be wearing shatnez. No one refutes that. No one argues the point. We have the other sources that we mentioned, like the law of Rabbi Yossi, that mamzerim, the illegitimate children, will become pure, and the Talmud concludes the halacha of the law is like him. We haven't done away with that one either. So as much as we've managed some of the sources, core sources that are categorical, which again, in the polemical debates, Christians cited, we haven't managed to do away with. How do we actually explain them? And here I bring you into a fascinating dispute. There were two greats. There was somebody called Rabbi Solomon ben Abraham ibn Adar, otherwise known as the Rashba. He lived in the 13th century, and he deals with this issue in a particular text of his called Chidushei Agadot. There he deals with it in a polemic context as response, and as he puts it, to those who argue against us, by reference, in other words, Christians who cite some of those sources to prove their theological contention, that the Torah itself, it's only a temporary measure. He says that when we talk about this reference, this term, the future to come, and mitzvahs will be abolished in the future to come, he says future to come doesn't mean the Messianic era. And I know he's being generous over here with his own interpretation, but he actually suggests the future to come is a general term that doesn't have to mean something very specific. It could actually refer to the future to come in everybody's life. That is to say, when we're dead. So when you say the commandments will be abrogated in the future to come, he's redefining that term. And he brings, and I'm not going to bring them all to you now, a whole range of Talmudic proof texts. And he demonstrates that it doesn't have to mean ultimate future of Messianic era. And then therefore he says that all of these references, like Rabbi Yosef, what did Rabbi Yosef say? When we say that we see from here that the commandments will no longer be applicable in the future to come, he says that means that the commandments are not going to any longer apply to the actual dead. Not to say that the commandments themselves will be abolished in the Messianic era. But when Rabbi Yosef says the mitzvahs will be abolished in the future to come, it means that, hey, when we're dead, we're no longer obligated to mitzvahs. Well, okay, that's pretty obvious. And it also begs a question. Because if that's what it means, and Rabbi Yosef is saying, okay, so I'm allowed to be buried in shrouds, mixture of wool and linen, because when I'm dead, I'm not obligated to mitzvahs. Well, what about his opponent in the Talmud, who says the dead cannot be buried in a mixture of wool and linen? Why not? So he goes on again to explain, quite compellingly so, that the real issue over here is, like a minor. You know, a child is not obligated to mitzvahs. And therefore, as halacha itself tells us, as much as a child is not obligated in the precepts of the Torah, they are, in theory, free to violate the prohibitions of the Torah. Indeed, it is brought in halacha that if a minor is seen to be consuming something forbidden, that is, non-kosher edibles, you don't have to necessarily prevent them from doing so. But one thing you cannot do, one thing would be wrong. You don't go feeding the kid non-kosher in the first instance. If he's doing what he's doing and you don't stop him, all right, you're not held to account. But you certainly don't go out of your way to feed the kid the non-kosher in the first instance. That's not acceptable. That's wrong. You have an obligation of chinuch, of education, etc. So Rabbi Yanai will tell you in a very similar vein, just like a child is not obligated in mitzvot, okay, the dead are not obligated in mitzvot either. No problem. But I'm not going to go out of my way to cause the dead to be doing something sinful, that is to say, to dress them in shrouds of a mixture of wool and linen. And the Rashba himself, this commentary himself, actually personally concludes and accepts the ruling that the dead can be buried in shrouds. Now, we still have a problem. Our problem is that, but they're going to wake up one day. And when they wake up, they're going to be wearing the shrouds. So he says, no problem. He maintains, and again he brings different sources to suggest that somehow these shrouds will dissolve before the people themselves actually get up. So in short, his position is that abrogation of mitzvot relates strictly to the time and duration of death, whether it be in the present era or the Messianic era, but not thereafter. And the Torah and its commandments will always remain relevant and will always remain applicable, even in the Messianic era, no less than now. And he goes through all the different sources and he analyzes them all along the same way. If you ask about Purim and he asks about Yom Kippur, that they will never be abrogated, he himself interprets the proof text, their remembrance will not cease from their descendants, is a divine promise and an assurance rather than an injunction. That is to say that sinfulness will cause the festivals to come into disuse. In other words, what he's actually saying is when you talk about the abolishment of the festivals, he says it doesn't mean that the festivals themselves will become abolished when Mashiach comes. It means that we ourselves, regrettably, are going to cause in the future, that is to say maybe even our own present era now, these festivals to become abolished. How so? By simply not observing them. Not that they in essence are abolished, but we abolish them by virtue of our own choice actions. So as far as he's concerned, he maintains mitzvahs will remain. If we talk about them becoming abolished in the future, it means only when we are in our deceased state. But in Mashiach's era, in the time of resurrection, etc., all the mitzvahs will remain absolutely in effect, all festivals. And there is a dynamic to Yom Kippur that extends, as he goes on to explain, well beyond just atonement for sins themselves. And Pesach will remain, and Shavuos will remain, and Sukkot will remain. The books of the scriptures, they're no longer relevant. They're not mitzvahs. They're just exhortations. The fast days, they're not mitzvahs per se. They're only really there to lament what we will no longer have to lament. That's his opinion. He has a chief disciple. That is Rabbi Yom Tov Ashbeli, otherwise known as the Ritva. He's a disciple of his, and he differs fundamentally from his teacher. He's passionate in his actual retort, and he maintains, what kind of nonsense is this? When you say the future to come means the future of your own life and your death, future to come is a common term that we use always in reference to Mashiach and that era. And if we talk about the mitzvahs being abrogated in the future to come, it doesn't mean in death. it actually means very really in the times of Mashiach himself. And he brings different proof texts as well. He quotes different rabbis from different pieces of Talmud where he makes the point very categorically to demonstrate this very point. He goes one critical step further, and he simply suggests the following. The abrogation of the commandments will not be in the earlier era of the days of Mashiach, but rather in the future to come, that is to say, at a much later stage. In other words, what he's simply saying is, when Mashiach comes, the mitzvahs will continue. But there will be an altogether different stage in time after Mashiach comes, the resurrection of the dead, a new world order. And the Torah itself, when God gave the Torah, as he did, then that's something that is applicable for as long as the Torah is being maintained within a world in which it was given. But when the world is no longer going to be as is, it's going to be an altogether different kind of world, then the Torah as it is no longer stands. So by definition, when Mashiach comes, and as Shmuel tells us, Samuel tells us in the Talmud, the only difference between our world and the Messianic era is just the subjugation to different monarchy. In other words, then we will have powerful Jewish dominion. As far as that's concerned, Torah will continue, mitzvahs will continue. At the outset, when Mashiach comes, pig is still out, Pesach is still in. But those things are only part of the Torah, which in itself was given in a world as we know it. When there's a new world order, that is to say, with the resurrection of the dead, then the Torah as we know it, he maintains, indeed will no longer be applicable. Pig is in, Pesach is out. And he also engages in this whole to and fro with regard to Judaism, Christianity, etc. And he says that the Torah was not given as temporary measure, as claimed by Christianity, but is relevant only for the whole duration of the normative reality of the world. And he deals with all of the Rashba, his master's various different claims. And he says very categorically, I objected to him, that is to say his own teacher, his own master. I have raised any number of questions against him, and he has not answered any of them appropriately. And that's where he leaves it. So what we have here is a huge difference of opinion, which comes down to defining whether or not we could look forward to that Big Mac or not, if you're losing sleep over this. The Rashba, that is the first source we cited, is straightforward. It's out. Mitzvahs remain intact always and forever. Any reference to abrogation in the future refers only to a different kind of future, namely when the person is dead. The Ritva, his chief disciple, will argue and maintain that they will be abrogated, but in a post-Messianic era, with the resurrection when there will be a new world order. Maimonides himself, who talks about the immutability of the Torah, could conform with either view, and there would be no contradiction. The Torah is immutable as he maintains, and when he says they will not be annulled, well, that could only be in reference to the Messianic era at the beginning, but not necessarily in regard to the future. What I want to do very briefly, because we hardly have any time, and maybe I laid myself out for trouble when giving this subject matter, because it's something that requires a solid 2 hours to really go into all of the reference, but I wanted to share with you 3 other brief alternatives, very brief alternatives to explain this whole concept. One of them is Rabbi Yitzchak Abarbanel, who himself was a philosopher. He was actually a financier. He was also King Alfonso V's personal treasurer. He was a genius of a man, and he composed a special volume to defend Maimonides' formulation of the 13 principles of faith. And he takes a very interesting, a reasonable approach to our problem. He says as follows: all eventual changes in the Messianic era are ab initio an integral part of the original Torah. In other words, all future changes are something that has already been stated or commanded to Moses at Sinai to become effective in due time, either in a specific way, relating to specific particular changes that we discussed, or in a general way. In other words, because the conditions will change. In other words, when God gave the Torah to Moses at Sinai, it's not in the written text. God also said to Moses, these laws, that's for now. Later, That's a different story. So it's not as if there's a contradiction to the abrogation of the mitzvot in the Messianic era, because God allowed for that or gave that as part and parcel of the Torah itself. Easy enough. Then there's Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, again a great halachic Kabbalist who lived in the 17th century, found himself engaging in a lot of debate with bishops and whatnot, and he appears to adopt the view of the earlier source that we cited, the Ritva. That is to say that there'll be a change in era, new world order, etc. However, he maintains the Torah will continue to be observed in a post-resurrection era. The difference will be that the observance then will no longer be in terms of legal obligations. It'll all be done voluntarily. You'll have the choice whether or not you want to eat that Big Mac. So what Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz says is that the laws will still be there, but in the same way our forefathers kept the Torah even prior to its having been given, as a self-imposed stringency, you'll have that option later on in the post-Messianic era as to whether or not you want to still keep these laws or not. You'll have the choice whether you're going to clean for Pesach or not. Finally, we have the Lubavitcher Rebbe, because this talk could not be completed without reflecting on that key source. And the Rebbe deals at length with an altogether different medrash that tells us, a well-known medrash, that a new Torah shall go forth from me. And he takes an approach, the Rebbe, reminiscent of the one that we just referenced from Rabbi Yitzchak Schochet. And that is to say, when we talk about the idea of the change in Torah is contained within the Torah itself. And the Rebbe goes on to elaborate on another principle where it says that everything, any new idea, any novel concept that any diligent student is yet to discover was already given to Moses at Sinai. So we're told. The obvious meaning of this principle is that the totality of Torah, written and oral, was given to Moshe at Sinai. Anything relevant to the daily conduct and the practices of the law was revealed to Moshe and transmitted by him immediately as practical rulings. Theoretical details, academic elaborations, derivation, etc., interpretation, insight, and so forth, they're not directly relevant to the applications of the law and would not therefore necessarily be immediate. They're found over the course of time through all the different polemics that rabbis grappled in, hermeneutic methodology, etc., and whatever have you. So in other words, everything, absolutely everything as we know it, is given to Moshe at Sinai. When you get a rabbi sitting there today bending over a book of Talmud, and suddenly he has a brainwave, wow, this is great, this makes sense, well, guess what? As much as you think that's your own innovation, if indeed it does make sense, it was already told to Moshe at Sinai. That's why you were able to access it. And maybe you're the first to make it available to reach to that conclusion, but ultimately it was already presented here to the world in the first instance. You know, Maimonides says of the Messianic era that the Jewish people will be great sages and know things that are presently concealed. These are Maimonides' words himself. And they will attain knowledge of their Creator that is presently beyond the extent of human capacity. By definition, we're all going to become so much cleverer, so much brighter. We'll all become geniuses. That's going to be the after effect of the Messianic era and all of the conditions. And that will also include a revelation of the mysteries and the deeper meanings of the Torah. So there is a much deeper layer, a much more sublime perception and understanding of the Torah that we cannot presently access. Something that will become available to us only by virtue of Mashiach's teachings and his guidance. And that will be so profound that, again, in the words of Maimonides, the Torah that man studies at present will be considered as absolutely vain compared to the teachings of Mashiach. Says the Rebbe, well, there you have it. It is in the context of that we say a new Torah will go forth from me. It doesn't mean that there's going to be a new Torah. The Old Testament becomes old and obsolete. It means that we are going to change. We are going to suddenly have a far more profound, sensitive, subtle, deeper, more spiritual understanding of the complexities of Torah that we can't even now presently even begin to fathom. And as such, all of a sudden, different layers are going to be peeled away. And we're going to see something that we presently don't see. The rules of it's not in heaven. And the idea of always following the majority of proper authorities, those rules are not going to change. But the reality of the different authorities' natural insight, the extent of their capacity will change. And that's going to lead to them issuing new legal pronouncements, which will either modify or indeed negate earlier ones in accordance with the new understanding of the human capacity. You know, we talk about how presently you'll find countless arguments between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. And we talk about how in the Messianic era, as much as we now follow the rulings of Hillel, in the Messianic era we'll follow the rulings of Shammai. The Rebbe explains, what does that mean? We're switching sides? No, it means that the perception of both Shammai and Hillel themselves will change, such that all of a sudden we're going to see something altogether different in what Hillel is saying and what Shammai is saying, and we will ultimately then follow the changed legal ruling of Shammai rather than that of Hillel. It follows then, as indeed the Abarbanel himself says, any eventual alterations, and that is to say that even if pig does become kosher, any eventual alterations, that is to say that even if illegitimate children do become pure, that is to say that even if the mixture of wool and linen suddenly become acceptable, those changes are not changes in the Torah given at Sinai. They're actually an integral part thereof. What we know, what we see at the moment, is what we understand at face value. The principle of immutability is fully preserved. The Torah will not change, we will change. And that, as far as what the Rebbe is saying then, in effect, means that yes, we might, in the Messianic era, with that deeper layer of understanding, come to the conclusion that the Big Mac really isn't such a problem after all. The Pesach need not necessarily be kept anymore. That the Torah says pig is out, Pesach is in. That's the way you and I get it now. But when Mashiach comes, it might all change, it might all be different. The implication of the various proof texts suggests categorically so, and we don't have a problem with that. It's because we'll change, we'll have a deeper understanding. What we need to hope and pray for is that Mashiach should come imminently, as Rabbi Yochanan himself concerned himself with, and when he does, he'll help us understand whether indeed we can change the menu here, as we began with at the National Jewish Retreat, when he himself will be giving us all the lectures, beginning with the kosher pig and telling us why that's what we could have for lunch. Let's hope it happens still before lunch. Thank you.